Yeah, sure. Let's get going. So hello everyone. So I'm Alex Morrison. I run, as Kieran just said, I run a digital agency called Cogapp that's dedicated to building a better online world in one way or another. Most of what we do right now is in the cultural sector. I'm also very involved with WiredSussex, and Cogapp dates back a long way. So we started off in 1985 before the internet, doing things with digital one way and another, and then interactive multimedia, and then online stuff. And over that time, we've been involved, I think, in about 5 different crises of one sort or another, and had to get through them. So what I'm going to talk about is based on that experience. Some of it more painful than others. Shall I go on with the talk from here, Kieran? Shall I just go into it?
Yeah, that would be great, and then we'll kind of.
Okay. So what I'm going to talk about is how to manage an organisation through a crisis like the COVID-19 lockdown that we're currently in. As I said, we've seen a few of these things, so I'm kind of partly dealing with what's here and partly remembering what's happened. And specifically, I'm going to suggest a way of doing this that's a bit different from business as usual. And it's based on that experience that I referred to, but it's also based on some principles that are literally battle tested, and that come from people that have written about this stuff and have put it into practice in other fields. And I'll talk a bit about that. I think before we get into it, I just need to say absolutely that what I'm talking about isn't going to make this easy. The situation that we're in is very, very tough. Lots of organizations are really going to struggle. Some won't get through it. And that's horrible, really, really horrible. So what I'm talking about isn't going to make any of that go away. What it might do is to provide some structure for how to get through it. And hopefully by having a bit of structure, you can reduce some anxiety, you can improve coherence, sort of coherence in the team, but also coherence in your behavior. And as a result of those two things, hopefully you can get some better results out of it. And marginal improvements may be critical at this stage, so hopefully that's a good thing. The paper that I'm going to talk about is up on our blog at cogapp.com. So if you go to if you want to find the whole thing written down, you can go to our blog on cogapp.com, and it's one of the first articles that's linked to on that section there. Not difficult to find. So to begin with, a bit of background about how do we end up here today, apart from COVID-19 and Wuhan and the wet market and all that. But as we kind of got into this whole thing at Cogapp, some of my colleagues asked the question, how should we be responding to this thing? And that prompted discussion, and that discussion led me to write down to make explicit the system that I'm going to talk about. It's kind of really what we were doing, but I think it's been very helpful writing it down of how to do these things. And then that's given us the structure that I'm going to talk to you about, which again has been helpful to us. So that's how we got here. Like most people who started a company, I didn't really start out trying to run a company. I started out because I was fed up with my previous employers, and I wanted to do some work, and I wanted to do it in a way that I thought would be better than the way that they were doing it. So that's how I ended up running a company. And I think, like a lot of people who do that, you start off and you're doing it because you are, or at least in your own opinion, good at what you do. And if the world agrees with you, then you end up with a business. And if that then prospers, then you end up running an organization. So you're doing two things really. You're doing the thing that you loved in the first place, trade, craft, the substance of it. But then you're doing a second thing on top of that, which is running this organization, which is a whole different skill set that you didn't really have in the past, and so I've kind of wandered through this world and tried to teach myself a bit about how to do it. And I'll talk in a little while about some of the thoughts on that. But the first thing to notice in this discussion is that we're managing in a crisis. So it's one thing to manage a business in the day-to-day, the regular course of things, where business is what it always is, and you can rely on certain things behaving in normal, rational ways, and you can rely on your colleagues being in a particular state, and so forth and so on. But managing in a crisis is different, and I want to say that I think there are three big risks that are inherent in a crisis situation that are not present under normal operating conditions, and they're three as follows. So the first is a failure to get to grips with the big existential questions that arise. So if you're running in normal operating conditions, you can broadly assume that if you were a good business yesterday, you're probably a good business today. In a crisis, there are really major questions about whether you've got a business, whether your business is going to survive, and if it's going to survive, in what form is it going to survive? And those questions are not normal things, but they're very uncomfortable things. They're questions that we don't like to look at, because we like to think that it's all okay and we're going to be fine. But in this situation, you really can't rely on that. And so you have to be a bit more grown up about it, and you have to face up to those questions in a fairly systematic way. So that's the first risk, is just not facing up to that, not facing up to it in a systematic and grown up way. The second issue is just losing control of the nitty-gritty day-to-day. So again, because it's chaotic, because things are happening, you can lose discipline and lose the rhythm and practice of actually doing the business at hand in, roughly speaking, the right order of business. That needs to be taken care of. And then finally, which is sort of at right angles to the first two risks, the risk is that you persist with something but don't notice that the conditions that made that action sensible have changed. So because things are changing very rapidly, you can set off saying, okay, well, we're going to do this, and then stuff happens and you just go on doing what you planned to do, but without noticing that, like the cartoon character that's run off the end of the cliff, that there's no ground underneath your feet anymore, and your legs are just spinning and you're about to go down. So we have to manage against those three risks, and the question is how to do it. And the answer is you can't do it in the way that you normally run your business. So I'm going to explain one way, at least, of how to do that. Before I do that, just a bit about business wisdom. I referred to the fact that I, and I think I'm, along with many others in this situation, set off just to do work and then ended up running a business. I never went to business school. I don't have an MBA. So at some point, as the business grew, I decided I really needed to learn a bit about this stuff, and I started to read. I started to do things. I subscribed to Harvard Business Review because it sounded good. I read some business books by people called things like Michael Porter, who's quite good. But in general, I have to say, most of the stuff I found in the conventional business world was written for conventional businesses, and particularly large-scale conventional businesses, the kind of Unilevers and Shells and BPs and so on, who provide the big consulting fees for the big business writers and so forth. And actually, what I have been doing, and what I think most people who are connected with WiredSussex have been doing, is actually doing something much more chaotic, much more agile, much more lightweight, and less corporate, less organized. And it was really when I discovered a writer called Steve Blank that I started to find things that really resonated for me. Steve Blank is the less well-known founder of the Lean Startup movement. And the person who wrote the book called Lean Startup, I think, is a guy called Eric Ries, who's really quite well known. But Steve Blank is his predecessor, who wrote a book with a very strange title, The 4 Steps to the Epiphany. The 4 Steps to the Epiphany is a fantastic book, and I totally recommend it to anybody. It's the point at which this whole idea of an agile approach started to get going. And what I'm going to talk about is ideas around agile and lean startup as applied to business. So I highly recommend Steve Blank. Through a kind of meandering route, I also came across somebody called Martin van Creveld. Martin van Creveld wrote a book called Command in War, which you can get on Abe Books or secondhand book forums, which is one of the most entertaining and instructive books I've ever read, and I utterly recommend it. The point about this being, as I may allude to later in a bit, is that what we're doing running small businesses, particularly small businesses in a crisis, is much more akin to trying to operate in a battle situation where all sorts of things are happening and information is in scarce supply and things are changing very rapidly and so forth. It's much more akin to that than it is to running Unilever or BP or whatever, where by and large you've got an enormous great ocean liner and you're just adjusting the settings a tiny bit. We're in a very small canoe in a very choppy sea, and we have to be extremely aware of the situation. So that's been my sort of journey in thinking about this stuff, and it led me then to the foundational notion, which is behind both agile software development, which is probably the biggest change in the way we do our work that's happened in the course of my career. It's been absolutely liberating and fantastic, but it's also behind lean startup, and it's I think it's the most important sort of idea in organization that has happened for probably since the beginning of the 20th century, really. And it comes out of the military. So this is hence Martin van Creveld, hence Steve Blank, who's got a military background himself. And it's this, the American military set out to understand how to operate, and I think the original theatre of this was combat flying. How do you win a dogfight was the question. It's then been applied, and it's the doctrine, particularly the military doctrine of the US Marine Corps, and it's this, that in order to be effective in a chaotic situation like the one we're currently in, like being in a battle, that the best thing to do is not to have a big plan up front, but to have a continuous process of OODA, observe, orient, decide, act. It's very, very simple. It's very profound. So instead of making a thumping great plan up front, which is what the Allied High Command did in the First World War, they made an enormous great plan for the Battle of the Somme. They worked out exactly what was going to happen. Then they hit go, and they had absolutely no idea what was going on. So some units had hideous losses. They had no idea. Some units had unexpected successes. They had no idea. And the command was unable to respond to either circumstance. Hence, its legendarily awful outcome. The counter to big planning up front is this OODA agile loop, where you say, well, we know roughly what we want to achieve. What we're going to do is we're going to have a look at the situation. We're going to orient ourselves around it. We're going to decide what to do next, do it, and then come back and work out what the next step is. So it's just as simple as that, but it's very, very profound when you actually put it into practice, as we know from building software, as we know from building enterprises, and as we're now finding out, I think, in the current crisis. So in many ways, it's what you do. It's many ways this is what entrepreneurs have to do if they're going to succeed. The worst mistake I ever made as an entrepreneur was trying to do a startup using big planning up front, which I was told was what was needed by the investors. And I built a sodding great business plan with an enormous great spreadsheet projecting, income in Q3 of 3 years hence or whatever. And I started to run the business based on that. And rightly, my fellow investors were utterly horrified by this. But that's another story. But applying OODA in a crisis, the key is, I think, is to address the 3 risks that I alluded to before. So in a normal course of operation, you don't really need to worry so much about the strategic risks. But in this situation, you really have to. And so what I'm saying is you apply this loop, but you do it at 2 levels in parallel. So you do it at an operational level. So you do your day-to-day business on an OODA loop, but you then run a parallel structure looking at the strategic questions that I alluded to, the ones about whether you are actually a viable business at this point. So at the strategic level, I think there are these 4 key questions that you've got to keep asking. And you can't get a definitive answer to these things because the situation is going to change. But you can get a pro tem answer to them at any stage and make decisions accordingly. And so the questions that I think you need to look at are these. So are we confident that the business will be viable in its current form at the current level in the mid to long term? So looking beyond the short term, looking at what's going to come out of this situation. Do we think that this is, have we still got a business? Is there going to be a market for what we're doing? And in the paper, I talk about, well, if you don't think you have in the current form at the current level, then can you scale back? Can you cut back? Can you change what you do? And so forth, and take decisions according to that. That is a crucial question, and it has to be looked at absolutely square. 3 sort of secondary questions then come out of that, and one is, what can we do to buy more time? Time is absolutely critical. Every entrepreneur knows this. You get some funding for a business, or you find some funding yourself, and it gives you a runway. How can you improve your runway? How can you give yourself as much time as possible to work this out? Because time, if you run out of cash, if you run out of runway, then whatever else, however good your prospects are in the mid to long term, if you run out of runway, you're dead. Third thing is, what can we do to improve our chances of viability in the mid to long term? What can we do that might make us more viable? If we're happy that we're going in roughly the right direction. And then finally, but really finally, are there any unusual opportunities that are opening up? So I think Rahm Emanuel, who was Barack Obama's mate who ran Chicago, said memorably, you should never let a serious crisis go to waste, because there may be things that you can do coming out of that crisis that you couldn't do any other way. And that is a good question that one should keep an eye on. In terms of operational priorities, again, I would say that there are two different parts to that, and one is the back office and the other is the front office. If we take the back office first, then your first priorities, and these need to be looked at really in order, I think. You've got to maintain staff welfare. You've got to actually make sure that everyone's okay and that they're more or less functional, and that where they're not functional, which you may not be able to achieve, then other people are there to pick up the slack, and that you adapt accordingly. And coherence, trust, confidence in the team is invaluable in making progress as things get hairy. It's particularly good if you've got existing structures that you can call on, that people rely on, and maintain as much as possible of that. Then it comes down to collecting receivables, managing cash, eliminating wastage, minimize your run rate. So how can you bring the run rate down as much as possible? People have been furloughing staff. That's clearly sensible if there's nothing for them to do. And then finally, obtain additional finance. So what are the government schemes that you might be able to use, or any other schemes that you might be able to use to get additional finance? If that's the back office, then the front office is about delivering existing business to existing clients. So key priority number one, make sure that you're keeping existing clients happy. Then what can you sell, if anything, of new work to existing clients? Then can you sell new work to known prospects? So we're an agency business, so our thing is let's do the projects we've got. Let's make sure everyone's really happy. Let's over deliver. Let's keep everything on track. Let's not go out the ball of anything that's going on. Let's see if we can do anything in addition for the existing clients that we've got. It's always much easier to sell work to existing clients. Then any new projects that are floating around, any new prospects that we can find, and then marketing programs aimed at existing contacts. So what can you do to raise awareness with existing contacts? And then finally, marketing programs aimed at new ones. The temptation, I think, and what I'm getting at here is the temptation is to not do things in priority order, to try and look for wild new things that you didn't know about. Try and, everyone gets a bit freaked out, and they start thinking, well, maybe we could pivot into a completely new area, and that, I think, if it's at the expense of losing the day-to-day of what you're actually doing, would be a terrible error. So those are the two loops explained. So the strategic loop and the operational loop, and you run them. So how do you put this into practice? One of the key insights behind the OODA loop system was that in a military situation, the people that won the battle weren't necessarily the strongest or largest force. They were the people that could run that loop most effectively and most rapidly. And that, I think, is a key insight in this situation. So the idea is to keep doing it. Doing this quarterly in this situation would be insanity. You've got to do it. You've got to do it faster than that. I'll explain a bit about how we do it at Cogapp. And it's just this. So we have a weekly management meeting. So the weekly management meeting, we sit down first thing Monday morning, and we go through essentially all of the operational strand first. So we take the back office, how it has the cash flow, we take staff welfare, we take existing business, we take all the things that come out of that, and we go through everything, and we make sure that we're on top of it, and we make sure that the tasks are assigned so we know what the priorities are for the week. And you then assign, then work out the staff assignments for the staff during the week. And that gives you then, this is why it works nicely, is that then gives you a base of observations, if you like, to then take to the second part of the meeting, which is the strategic discussion. So you've now looked at everything at the kind of day-to-day level, and then the moment comes that you need to shift up a gear and start asking those 4 key questions about the strategy of the business. So at that point, you then say, well, how's it looking? And is it looking good? Are we, can we see how all this comes out and works well, or are we heading towards something that isn't going to work? In which case, then we need to take some decisions and feed them back down to the operational level, because they will then need implementation. So that meeting takes about 3 hours. It's really quite a long meeting. It goes through everything, but out the back of it, you then have a group that has been through everything and has a consensus view on the week ahead, and everyone can then get on with it, and then that allows you then to take the next 4.5 days to actually do the work and not have to worry about whether these things have been unaddressed, and knowing that whatever insights you gather over the week, you can bring them back to the next session and keep going around. So it gives you, as I said up front, it doesn't make it particularly easy. It doesn't release you from the critical issue, and I think the critical issue here is about orientation and decisions. So it's the two bits in the middle of the OOD loop that are really difficult, aren't they? So observation, where you go around the world and you observe and you gather data, but then it's actually orienting yourself and trying to really understand what those the data is telling you, and then taking the right decisions about that. That's what's going to make the difference here. So it doesn't make it easy, but it does give it structure, which I think is probably the beginning of what we need, at least. So that's what I wanted to say. That's what my colleagues prompted me to sort of make explicit. It's working for us. I hope it works for other people. It's pleasingly kind of connected to, as I say, to these people who I think are probably the best business advisors, sources of business wisdom that I've come across, the Steve Blanks and Martin Van Crevels. So just to sum up, managing an organization at a time like this it's not the same as business as usual. In particular, you've got these big strategic risks that you've got to work out how to deal with, and if you do something along the lines of what I've discussed, i.e. you apply this OODA loop across both strands, the day-to-day operational and strategic, then at least you've got a system for attacking things and for bringing your colleagues and yourself together to get through it one way or another. And it does take some discipline. You have to be able to organize a weekly meeting. You have to be able to gather data in a sensible way. But it's not rocket science. It's not the most difficult thing in the world. And I think it's worth it. I think it's a good system. So there you go. I hope that I hope it's useful. Good luck to everyone. This is super difficult. I would say started Cogapp back in the 1980s. I think we've been through at least 5 really serious crises, but I think I have to say that what we're dealing with now is by far the worst of anything we've seen. It's the most difficult thing that we've seen. So don't underestimate the challenge at all. So yeah, good luck. As I said before, the paper that I'm talking about, I think Kieran has posted a link to it on the chat for this, but it's on our blog at cogapp.com, and it's one of the first articles listed.